Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in this bonus episode of Royal Revolutions. And we are so excited to be here to share this information about this new podcast with you. Now, you may have listened to some of the episodes already and met Gareth and James before, but they will tell you a little bit about themselves in a moment, but not too much, because you can find them both on all their various different social medias to see what they do, how they do it, and when they do it. If you haven't met me before, hello, it's lovely to see you. My name is Catherine Ibbotson. You may know me or have come across me as the historical collaborator. So you might, if you really want to, be able to find me somewhere as well. But I am really excited and honoured to be here today with Gareth and James to talk to you about the new podcast, what you can expect, how you can get involved, thought processes behind it, and what we're going to see over the coming episodes. So I'm going to hand over now to Gareth to tell you a little bit more, but then the discussion will very much be open to what you can expect in future and how exciting it's going to be. So Gareth and James, hello, and thank you so much for having me down. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for being here. And it's real, just so everyone listening knows, it's a privilege for us to have Catherine hosting this episode today, because I always think of Catherine a little bit like the iceberg of the Royal History online world, because yes, we do see you and you do crop up, but that's only the tip of what you actually do, because you're very much under the surface, coordinating a lot of the stuff that people, be it content, be it books, be it events, a lot of what people interact with in terms of royal history, you have been connected to. So it's wonderful for us to have you being part of this, and a big I think marketers call it a halo effect for us. So thank you for doing this interview. So how can I talk about what we're doing? People may know. So Royal History Geeks, which is a what would you call it? A platform, I guess, that I created, I don't know how many years ago now. Does a lot of blogging, social media content. About a year and a half ago, James and I teamed up to do some podcasts, and if you look on the website, there's a few different ones. There's sort of catch-all where just all the content that we put up goes up. There's some interviews that I've done, which I've sort of streamlined as its own series. There's a series that James and I did, I guess 18 months ago, called Coronation Catastrophes, where we took, which we had a lot of fun doing. We basically took 4 coronations, and we talked about the background, the politics around them, the fun on the day, the problems on the day, the controversies. And it was really great because we were dipping in to different eras of history, but using the coronation as a red thread that goes across all of them. But what we did find was actually we could have done so much more on each of those events. So we wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the great revolutions, that, if you like, the turning points in royal history, where something has happened that means that what comes next isn't just a progression, but it's something quite different to what it otherwise may have been, and go into detail on those. And so we wanted to start Royal Revolutions as a podcast, as an ongoing podcast with seasons, but rather than just do one-offs on events or revolutions, we wanted to take a whole season to go into each one. So Royal Revolution Season 1, which you're all listening to, this is the bonus episode of it, is going to focus on what was arguably the most recent royal revolution of the Abdication Crisis, although you could argue there's been some since, of course. And that, for me, has been brilliant. I'm more of a late medievalist, so looking at something a bit different, and the wealth of source material you get compared to, say, a Henry VII reign kind of situation is incredible. And so it's less about digging around to find out what happened when, and much more about an analysis of the mountains of stuff in front of you. And that's what we're looking to unpack over a number of episodes.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and I think one of the reasons as well for choosing 1936 as our starting point for the series is the fact that it is such a pivotal moment in our history, and it is, of course, now nearly 90 years ago. But it's something that if you said to somebody the abdication, that's what they would think of, even because it's something which is not unprecedented, but certainly something which is very unusual within British history. Although there is it's one of those things that it's not quite the done thing. It's not quite British, I think. It's something that we tend to think of with the continental European monarchies. So, there's a long tradition of it in the Netherlands with Queen Wilhelmina, Queen Juliana, Beatrix, and we've also seen it in Belgium, in Spain, and most recently in Denmark. But it's something that we don't tend to see here, and so that's why it's a lot more. It's remembered a lot more shrouded in history and the sort of threat that's going on.
I think there's something very important that connects the things you just said there. So first of all, Gareth, you were talking about how we look at separate events, and then you said that you wanted to thread it all together, and I think that's really important. History is very often studied in periods, or a particular monarch, or a certain significant event. And these are all very important things to look at, but sometimes we do miss how these things interconnect, what comes before and after, because at the end of the day, it's fluid. Everything that exists around us now is the sum total of what's happened previously. And James, as you say, this is a big thing, and it had this knock-on effect, because without this abdication, we wouldn't have just had the enormously successful and well-received reign of her late Majesty Elizabeth II. And how she, obviously it's not ruled now, people often still say ruled, but how she reigned, you can obviously see the differences for people who perhaps know a little bit about the later Stuart period particularly, and see how the constitution started to change. But she really was a well-respected, well-received woman throughout the world, throughout her life. And it's difficult to say where the monarchy would be with or without her. However, that is possibly contentious and an issue for another time. But whilst we're talking about possible other topics, why did you start with this one? I mean, it's a fascinating story, and like anything, it's surrounded by but what's and ifs and misinformation. So why did you exactly start with this one? I know, James, you've touched on that a little bit, but there's lots of things you're obviously going to cover throughout the series. And what made you think this is the one that we want to lead with?
Good question. What do you think, James? I mean, I remember when we decided, because I was messaging you, I was in a pub and I was quite drunk. So I don't massively remember whether I had a really logical thought process. But I think you suggested it, so you may have had more of one.
Well, I think the reason is that 1936 is very different from any of the other applications that you see in history. They tended to happen because of political revolt, or because of a movement within the country. A peasant revolt was not an abdication, but it was precursor to problems for Richard II. And if you look at the disquiet within the nobility with, say, Edward II, whereas in 1936 it's much more of a personal story around not only the love affair between Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, but you've also then got the background of the whole political movement of the age around national government, around fascism, around relationships with Europe. And I think that very often they are forgotten in preference for people looking at just the love story. And I think that it's important to look at it within that context and also look at it within the round. And I think that it's funny, wasn't it, Gareth, you said the other day that researching about it, you found very little that you would recommend Edward VIII or Duke of Windsor as he became as a person that you would want to know or want to have as a friend.
Well, that's one thing I've been worried about, because I mean, James and I both approach royal history from a slightly different vantage point, and that James is much more of a contemporary royal watcher or commentator and broadcaster on today's royal family, with extensive knowledge stretching back to prehistory, but with particularly detailed knowledge probably for the reign of Queen Victoria, which is where sort of the modern concept of the royal family comes from, arguably, to today, whereas I'm much more rooted in the 15th and to an extent the 16th century in terms of my interests. So I think it's fair to say that But what we have in common is we're both really, really committed monarchists. And that's great, and it's the only way something like this would happen. But one thing I'm wary of is the biases that we bring to the table. And because we all are in love with, yes, the late Queen, but also the late Queen Mother, who, if anything, almost inspired more affection in people of our age, in some ways. I was worried that I would never give the Duke of Windsor, as he became, a fair crack of the whip. And as an historian, you've got to try to do that. You know you'll never fully achieve objectivity, but you've got to check your biases, state your biases, and work to reduce them. So as a result, the first thing I read in my research was his own account, the Duke of Windsor's own account in his memoirs. And I've read other stuff since, and they have only made me like him less as a human being. And that's unusual, because normally getting into someone else's head helps. But I think, and I just have to be honest about that, because I think people being aware, I need listeners to know that I have tried, but I've not succeeded in particularly resetting my biases. And it would be fascinating. And I think James and I have to be who we are and bring to the table what we can bring. But I also think it would be really good if someone who's more sympathetic to the Duke of Windsor also does a podcast on this.
The thing I would say, though, that there's a difference between just having your biases and checking. And firstly, a lot of what you've just said, you've done that from first-hand source material. It's not just through your own bias. That has informed your thinking. And if it reinforces what you were thinking before, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's if you just approach it with that bias without challenging it, without checking it, without looking, does the evidence support it? So I think that's that. I don't think you should do yourself down there, Gareth, because I think that's very different from just approaching it with a bias and not questioning it and not looking at how that affects your response to the events.
I agree. I think it's just about being honest, isn't it? And saying, like, the truth is, as objective as we will try to be throughout this, I suspect that someone who's probably A Republican and B got a bit more sympathy with other things that might be going on at the time might have a different opinion of him. But I mean, Catherine, do you, as someone, because you're like me in that you tend to be a little bit more rooted in the sort of you're like me in that you probably see anything post 1536 as current affairs rather than history. But do you have much of a sense? I do have my
feet up in the 15th century, yes.
And we're like, I think we're all roughly a similar age. Do you think, I'm just trying to turn Teams off because it keeps pinging at me. Do you have much of a sense, and have you had much of a sense, you think, sort of growing up in England, of who Edward VIII was and whether you have an opinion of him?
I think one of the things about him is that obviously our sense of monarchy has been stable. That you haven't seen the big shifts in what monarchy is, how much we've gone from sort of the sense of divine right to rule, the absolute power of the monarch, right up to, well, the monarch is just a head of state. For us, it's been very much, because we, up until obviously a couple of years ago, we've only ever known one reigning monarch. And by the time we were born, because we were all extremely youthful, she had been in position, she had been the reigning monarch.
Nearly 70 years by the time we were born.
Yes, exactly. She was, she'd been in her role for quite some time. So I think in some ways it's harder for us to perceive differences and changes and the concept of an abdication seriousness and the waves this would have put through our history of monarchy within our own lifetime. And most of the people around us is extremely stable. And so I think we very much have this narrative of the story, as far as long as I can remember it, really was this: he was an extremely selfish, narcissistic man, very hedonistic, and he basically chucked all his toys out of the pram because he couldn't have the woman that he wanted. And so then there was this one narrative that sort of, it was for love, and everyone goes, oh, that's so lovely, he did it for the woman he loved. And then it was actually, well, no, he dug his heels in. He said, I want that. they said, no, you can't do that. You've got to think about who you are and what your role is. And he sort of called everyone's bluff and said, well, okay, if you're not going to let me do it, then I'll abdicate. And they went, yeah, but you won't do that. And he was like, well, here I am abdicating.
Yeah, what's me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Check out this instrument of abdication, bitch.
Yeah.
So that, yeah.
Do you want to try me? And then they went, oh. But no one was bothered because I don't think they were, because it looked bad for the institution. But in terms of him as an individual, people were like, well, you know, things
there
are
was. I was surprised doing the research for this. You know, it's interesting because we can now research this more easily than we could have done a generation before, because so many documents are now publicly domain that were restricted till reasonably recently. And there'd always been, well, let me put it a different way. James talked about other abdications in royal history, but of course, in the past, they may have been dressed up as abdications, but they never were. They were always forced. Yeah. And, you know, Richard II, in theory, spontaneously decides to hand over his throne to his cousin. Well, he didn't. His cousin had an army full of many, many men marching rather close to him, and Richard was in prison. So, you know, that's not really an abdication. Similarly, when James II abdicates and his decision to flee the country is interpreted as him abdicating rather than just not wanting to die because William of Orange had a big army. I suppose until this project, I would have said Edward VIII is the only genuine abdication rather than do you call it a disposition? I don't suppose what do you call it? A disposition, I suppose, don't you? Of being deposed. And actually, during this research, I've been like, yes, but also no, because it became clearer to me for the first time, looking at it more from the political point of view rather than the royal point of view, how much people wanted to use this to get him out. And how, yes, it looked bad, but Edward VIII going, even in a controversial setting, is better than Edward VIII staying. And sure. Wallace is almost a piece of good news that will help us do that. And I'd never really got that before.
We were talking very briefly before we came on about the resurrection years in more recent years, where people have come in and they've taken a historical figure who's very much been given a certain persona or had a certain way of being looked at, and how actually we have to be careful with the biases that Gareth was just talking about. And it's good that people are doing this. It's good that people are saying, well, here's a narrative about a particular person. And actually, we're going to challenge that. We're going to look more widely. The danger, as Gareth said, is putting your own spin on it and being a little bit biased. But I think we very much get Wallace as the scapegoat, don't we? She was this terrible, you know, in many moons ago, she may have been like a she-wolf or something of that nature. But one of the things I think, as people are, as you both have been, looking at this a little bit more closely, is what we see is perhaps she is a little bit of a scapegoat. I've heard about her, everything from she was this terrible, wicked woman who took advantage of him because it improved her social standing and so on and so forth, up until she actually really didn't want to marry him and she felt forced into this corner. And then, of course, we're going to have all these narratives in between those two things. So I think when you have discussions like the one that you're having, it's really, really important, because we do see so many different things, and people, I don't know if you have both found this, you will have done touching, going back again to people pick what their biases are and they stick to them. People will find a story or a version that they've heard a lot, and it's very hard for them to separate themselves from the narrative of what they believe to be true. And there are certain factions in history who will only read what supports what they want to believe. And
I don't know what you're possibly thinking about, Catherine, as an example. I can't think.
I think if you don't know, then welcome to the peaceful side of history.
Probably something about the Georgians, I'm guessing. You know.
Of course. Love the Georgians, though. They're hilarious for all the wrong reasons. But it's it's a terrible thing to do. Do be prepared to be challenged, and you may come back to the same conclusions. But I think, you know, if you're not prepared to challenge yourself, I think one of the things that we sometimes say to some of the ladies that I work with is the more you learn, the more you should realise you don't know.
Absolutely, 100%.
So people may come in to this podcast and think, oh, well, I don't know, I quite like the sound of it, and then they're hearing you saying, oh, I don't know, he didn't sound like a very pleasant chap, and me going, well, probably better off without him if we're being completely honest. Don't discount that. Anybody who listens to any of these episodes must absolutely come away with or without their own opinion still. But one of the things about history that's quite fun is because there's so much we don't know and we can't ever possibly know, it gives us a chance to really pick things to pieces over and over again. And a lot of the discussions, arguments sometimes will never die because they can't be resolved. And I think that's a very valuable thing. So based on this kind of thought processes, we almost don't know quite what's going to come up. And it is a little bit unpredictable what people might hear. They're not just going to hear every episode, well, then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. You know, it's not the way that people traditionally think history is going to be presented, which is definitely an issue we have when we try to drag people kicking and screaming into our world of the love of history. What are you excited about with doing this podcast? What is really making you go, oh, we can't wait, we're thrilled about what we're going to share?
Well, I think for me, it's just having that discussion, because I think that one of the exciting things about history is being able to share it with other people. It's not just reading history for yourself. And so to have somebody like Gareth to be able to who is, you know, just as interested in history and certainly in royal history, to be able to talk to and bounce those ideas off and to agree, disagree, all of those things. That's for me, it's just exciting to be able to do that. And then when we get feedback from people who've listened and they ask questions and give comments as well, I mean, that's, you know, it's just nice to be able to take part and to be able to see all of that.
I think for me, this is quite a geeky answer, but one of the things I love doing, whatever, you know, we all, as historians, whatever we call ourselves, history commentators, writers, influencers, whatever, generally speaking, we're all attracted to concepts. I know I certainly am. That's how my brain works, and we move quickly between concepts. That's why we can do interviews like this very easily. Collectively, we'll all dance around loads of topics. But it's that way of thinking that can end up leading you down false narratives or lazy narratives. And what I love doing in all history is to try and break events down to the most minute detail you can. So, you know, where was that person day by day, week by week, month by month, what was going on, and piece it all together from that sort of step-by-step way, and actually see how well the narrative you have in your head holds up to that. For me, as a late medieval, early Tudor historian, that's rare that you have the detail you can ever do that with to the precision you'd like. With the Abdication Crisis, basically from about the third week of October 1936 until mid-December, you can almost do a day-by-day breakdown of what was happening and who was saying what to whom. And that is a fantastic way of deconstructing narratives and building more accurate ones. Because you can actually say, when you read a book, everybody actually says that Churchill said this to so-and-so. Like, well, no, it can't actually, because Churchill wasn't back in England until this day. Oh, that's a bad example because Churchill was in the country the whole time. But do you know what I mean? Like, or Beaverbrook was actually back in London until this date. So that narrative can't be right. And it's only when you do it at that level of detail. And that's exciting. And that's a very geeky answer to what excites me. But I'm also excited to challenge my biases, which I've talked about a lot. Gareth Russell, who wrote a brilliant book about the Queen Mother, which I suspect you both read, said when researching it, and I think he did History After Dark with you on this, Catherine, a year or so ago, and he said, I actually found I didn't like Edward and Wallace going into this. With Edward, I found I had even more negative perception after researching. But with Wallace, I had a slightly more positive reception after researching. Which, as you said, when you're writing a book from the vantage point of the Queen Mother, that's a pretty remarkable thing. And I completely understand, because I've come out the same way. And I'm not saying Wallace is now my history hero or anything like that, but she has been very damaged by the wicked women trope. And actually, when you see some quite sinister things, so there's a big debate, which we'll get into on the podcast, which we'll never be able to answer, because how can anyone, that she may have been intersex, which has come up in the discussion. Now, that's a perfectly worthwhile thing to explore. We could ask any questions we want to of people, as long as we do so, I think, sensitively and compassionately. But it plays in the way people write about it, discuss it, to again a wicked kind of, as if, well, so what if she is intersex? Does that mean she had no right to be loved? Does that make her any less lovable? Of course it doesn't, and nor is it her being dishonest in some way. It's just a biological reality for her, if that was true. So you see her the victim of a number of tropes, and while I don't think she is any great hero of history, she does require and deserve some redemption.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think one of the dangers, because you were talking, Catherine, is that you get now so many people who look at a certain historical figure, and because they have an interest in them, because they think that the way they've been treated is unfair, but then sometimes it goes much too far, and you end up seeing them merely as heroic and not seeing any of their flaws. And I think that with Wallace, in particular, she's somebody that you can see her character flaws. You can see, why elements of her reputation are true and are deserved, but you can also pick out where she has been unfairly treated throughout history. And I think that that's why she's actually quite a fascinating character. And also, there is, although it's not as well known, there is actually quite a wealth of material written by people who were sympathetic towards her, or in interviews, and that gives you a very different take on her. And of course, you need to treat those with caution, because if somebody's her friend, then they're going to write about her far more sympathetically. We know that, but that doesn't mean to say that you can't get value in what's said there. And I think that
it shows she has friends, doesn't it? At the end of the day,
yes, she did have friends, and she had quite loyal friends.
I haven't got any.
I'm your friend.
Oh, thank you.
I love you.
Thank you. You both could write nice things about me when I snare a king away.
No, but I think that she did have friends. She did have quite loyal friends, and I think that can easily be forgotten. And I think that's why I think it is possible to have a degree of sympathy for her, because of the way in which she was vilified. Because was that entirely fair? That's the question. I think that I think people are more likely to go away with, rather than was the Duke of Windsor entirely, is he somebody that you can be sympathetic to?
I certainly don't envy Wallace Simpson, is all I can really say. So you're both talking there about looking at the different sources, and people may not be aware that you could read his memoirs. They might not be aware that there are a lot of these pro-Wallace materials, because it's not been pushed. It didn't sit in narrative, I suppose, over the years. So I'm going to leave this now really into discussion to be able to talk about this whole season 1 a little bit more widely. So resources or sources are really important for all the reasons that we've covered. So just tell us a little bit about the sort of sources that you use, where you've gone for them, things you can recommend, pitfalls, all the usual bits and pieces, because people will read, as people in all different areas of history, levels of interest in history, whether they have a particular period, whether they work in history or they don't. We can all access different things and read things at different levels, and some things are better quality than others, and there are some things that you have to be in very specific situations to be able to get access to. You have to have a recommendation, or you have to make an application with a good reason why you have to be let into a particular archive, for example. So what are you doing in terms of accessing source materials that are going to really help you flesh out the conversations that you're having?
There's a range of sources for this, which is brilliant. Again, particularly if you come like me from the sort of early Tudor era where you are more limited. There's quite a lot of personal accounts written, which I'll let James speak to in a moment because he's more familiar with them than I am, and we have slightly divided and conquered in terms of the sources we've both looked at. There's basically a lot of stuff's either online or it's in the Royal Archives and you're going to struggle to get it. So in terms of the stuff that's reasonably readily available, you've got letters. So they're mostly like Churchill Archives have got most of them online, which are always obviously coming from a partial point of view, whatever it might be, but they're there. There is the Duke of Windsor's own account, which is not necessarily, it's very much his opinion, obviously, but it is sound from a timeline point of view. You can verify the dates and times, more or less. There's a few things he's clearly misremembered. You can't blame anyone for that. That does happen. But that does give you a broad outline of the timings of everything. There are then some very public records. So this was discussed in Parliament. The Prime Minister gave speeches on it. That's easily accessible on Hansard in the same way that something Keir Starmer said last week in Parliament is easily accessible on Hansard. There are minutes of cabinet meetings. What I would say is when it's really kicking off, it all kicks off very, very quickly. So yes, you have the contemporary press cuttings, but this story breaks in the media because of an agreement not to publish. This story breaks in the media on the 3rd of December. By the 11th, it's gone. So there's not a great deal of time when things are being talked about and people feel confident to write stuff down, even within government, where it's a documented period. So, and that's where you have to look at diary entries. What I would just say about the more harder to get information. So a couple of years ago, maybe a few more than maybe 5 years ago now, there was this brilliant book published, which you won't be able to see because it's got my screen blurred, by Alexander Larman called The Crown and Crisis. Now that is it's an excellent biography, and for a very good reason, because it's not a biography, it's an exploration of this topic, and he has read previously unseen documents in the Royal Archives, and it's really the first thing of this quality to be written post the sort of MI5 and MI6 restrictions on time of certain sources has passed. And he has got a lot of source material in this that you can't get elsewhere. Obviously, we have to be careful because it's all coming through his prism, and his prism is a good one, but it's ultimately still one person's interpretation of events and how they've chosen to use sources. But there's a lot out there. And then there's the personal accounts of members of the royal family, which James is more familiar with than I am.
Yeah, and so with that, you have Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, wrote a memoir in 1983, and that she was actually present at Marlborough House the evening that the King went to speak to Queen Mary. Now, she played very little part in the proceedings, so it's not a full first-hand account, but nevertheless it gives an eyewitness account of the tension at the time and of the dynamics within the family. But also, she talks about, in 1938, the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester had been in Kenya, and when they were flying back, were asked to go and visit the Windsors. And so you've got the account of that first meeting, but also of the public reaction that they received after that. And another good source is James Pope Hennessy's biography of Queen Mary, which is the official biography. Well, Hugo Vickers a few years ago did look at all of the notes that he'd made, and they were published in the Quest for Queen Mary. And so that again is a very interesting one, because that includes the accounts of the interviews that Pope Hennessy had with people talking about Queen Mary, talking about and obviously that era, as well as the abdication itself. So again, that's a very interesting one. And there's also accounts from people who knew the Windsors quite well. So in particular, Diana Moseley, of course better known as the wife of the fascist leader Sir Oswald Mosley. After they left the UK, they lived quite near the Windsors, in the outskirts of Paris, and she published a biography of a very sympathetic biography, must be said, to the Duchess of Windsor in, I think, 1980, and she also mentions her in her own memoirs too. So they used to visit quite regularly. So that gives you an idea of the dynamic between them as an elderly couple, but also the atmosphere and the life in which they were living, and a lot of the artifacts that he had brought with him from his former life. So he had a red dispatch box with the king on it. He also had his garter robes and things like that. So it's very interesting that after he'd given up that life, the way in which they were remembering it much later. So I think that while you have to be careful with accounts like that, it does give you a bit more flavour towards them of them as individuals, rather than just looking at the dry times. But also one last thing on, because you were talking about the newspaper archives, and yes, you're right, this did happen very quickly in the media because it had been blacked out. But one thing which is actually quite useful for looking back is if you look at the court circular, and you can see at the first time that Wallis was invited, when she was at the Jubilee Ball, you can also see when the king was not at an engagement in Aberdeen because he had chosen to greet her at Balmoral instead. You can trace back some of those dates and times too, and I think that that's quite interesting for you to be able to back up some of the opinions that come out later. You can trace where they were at a particular time and the significance that some of that will have had.
One of the things I was worried about when we started looking at the sources was we are looking at this whole event from the prism of the elite, basically either government or royalty. And I wanted to see, well, what could we do? Now, on one sense, my mum's parents were 10-ish when this happened. So I remember speaking to them a bit about it. So you did get that sort of non-elite perspective from just our own conversations with relatives. But what it became clear to me doing this research, because of that timeline that James has just mentioned, is it's not really fair to say what was the ordinary person thinking about this, because they were never given any time whatsoever to digest it or consider it. So yes, everyone in high society knew all about it throughout the whole, really, of 1936. But if you were in any way outside that circle, and as we know, there wasn't much bridging between those two circles, then you found out about it on, I think it was the 3rd of December. He was gone just a week and one day later. He was no longer King of the United Kingdom. So yes, of course, people would have had an instant reaction, but it's hardly fair to suggest that would have been their considered long-term reaction to the situation. We just don't have it because it could never have existed.
No, but one thing I would say is that you can get the reactions of people, that those immediate reactions and the reactions in the short period afterwards, when there were protests saying we don't want George VI, we want Edward VIII, and in the lead up to the coronation of George VI and Queen Elizabeth, and the way in which souvenirs were hastily changed, and the way in which people were commenting, and also because if you look at we spoke about the way that history has spoken about Wallis, and in particular also with the reaction that there was initially towards George VI being king. There was in certain circles there was quite a bit of disquiet and questioning, and not all of that was from the elite. Some of that was from people, from the ordinary people that you hear quoted. And I think that so you can get a sense of that shock, that disbelief, and of the way in which I think people were surprised of this break in the natural order, and was everything going to be all right? And I think that very often is forgotten or glossed over, because it may not have been for a long period, but it was still, that those feelings were still there, I think, at the time.
Right, so you have an awful lot of source materials you've access there, and where you can get them and how you can use them. So this is obviously a lot. So it's an awful lot of information you're going to put together for people, which is fantastic, because it goes back to what we were saying earlier about how it's very easy to have quite a narrow perspective and only have so much information with which to find out and make these judgments. So now you have this wealth of information that you are able to give to other people. how are you going to put this together? What have you made as a decision in the ways you're going to present this to everybody, and how you're going to give people that information in a way that you hope will be engaging, that will allow them to come back to you and really get people intrigued and interested in this really significant event in history?
That's a very good question, and we should probably talk about that at some stage, shouldn't we, James? No, I'm joking. We do have a plan. Shall I kick off, and then you could? So basically, it's a continuity podcast of the event. So by that I mean we will start at the beginning, work our way through logically until we get to the end, pausing at times for more analysis and to go deeper into a particular topic. So what we've basically done is we've put everything we've researched into a chronology, sort of starting from, to an extent, when they're both born, because we want to look a bit at their lives. We're not going to do an awful lot of their lives leading up to the crisis, but we are going to, and actually episode 1 is mostly just about who they were as people and their relationship before you get to the king becoming king. And then once we get into 1936 and literally Edward ascends the throne almost at the very beginning of 1936. And then we do take the year through much more slowly among different episodes to look at how it all unfolded. So as a result, it's going to have a good pace, it's going to have a good structure, and someone could start episode 1 knowing almost nothing about it and get to the end without feeling, and they should have been taken on a logical journey. That said, I think if you listen to the episodes out of sequence, it will still work, but you'll get most from it. And whereas for Coronation Catastrophes, it didn't matter, you could listen to them in any order. Whereas this one, you'll get more out of it if you start at the beginning and go through to the end. But interestingly, at the moment, we've roughly planned out 7 episodes. It might be that, which shows you the level of detail we want to go into. It might, and they'll all be roughly an hour. It might be we end up doing more than 7 episodes as we go through. And I should just say as well, what we've done through this process is we've identified a couple of areas where we don't have the knowledge between us. And we're not gonna have the knowledge between us by just reading a couple more books before we start recording. So there will be guest interviews with experts dropped in at various points just to illuminate some context we don't feel qualified to give.
That's amazing. Everybody loves a good guest interview, don't they? And I think that again goes back to what you covered right at the start, Gareth, is it's bringing in more perspectives, isn't it? Which is really, really valuable. James, what would you like to add?
Well, I think as well that it's, like I said before, it's great to have the opportunity to, once you've got that source material, to be able to talk it through, to be able to discuss it. And I hope that that's what people take away from it, that it is a discussion, and that what we're saying, you might agree with, you might disagree with, and it's always exciting to hear what other people think of from your own discussions and from your own work.
I think sometimes when work is produced in a series, or whichever format it goes out in, it can be quite easy for people reading or listening to assume that you've come in with this amount of knowledge and you're just regurgitating it, and then you'll come out at the end with the same kind of knowledge in your head. But I think what's really interesting about this, from what you said to me, is that for you, both of you, it's a journey, both separately and then coming together as well. You've not just gone, well, here's a series of information, on this date this happened, and then this person said that, and then they left that building, and then so-and-so had an argument, and then, here's a publication of several books and the dates they came in, and not dry, but you're prepared to be challenged, and you're prepared to have conversations that unfurl more conversations. And if that means creating more source, more materials, then that's what you'll do for people, which I think is wonderful. And it goes back again to what we were saying much earlier about making people look at things, being very thought-provoking, challenging your own biases. So what's exciting for me in listening to this is that it's a really live project. Although it has, it's got static sources and it's bringing these things. It's not. It's almost, as for people like myself who are going to come in and listen, we can only, in some ways, guess what's going to come at the end. But then we have that in common with you, which is just wonderful. So, are there ways that other people can get involved? How can they contact you? Can they field questions? When can they do that?
that's an important point, actually, because the last episode is just going to be questions.
Fabulous.
And we should get you back for it, Catherine, because you probably need to help keep us in order. Because we tangent a lot. And we leave some of it in.
That's history, though.
Yeah,
you cannot, somebody who loves history, you cannot go, can you just give me a quick answer to this?
Know.
No.
Well, but to give you an example, we did a podcast recently, but it went out recently, we recorded it some time ago, on Richard III, and we had a 15-minute tangent as to whether it's appropriate to call Diana Princess Diana. So, I mean, we could get anywhere from anywhere. So, and I'm doing that now, even though you asked a very simple question about getting in touch with us.
You need a kind of alternative stroke best bits stroke other interesting things that came up episode as
exactly and we can and I do take clips and just whack them on YouTube as a random discussion about something else, but a lot survives into the podcast, so people can get in touch with us. So Royal History Geeks exists on Facebook, Instagram, Discord, and on Twitter or X, whatever it's called. It doesn't. I'm on Blue Sky as just Gareth Streeter, but I'm not. There's not a Royal History Geeks on Blue Sky, and on YouTube. So get in touch with us through any of those platforms with a question, or Royal History Geeks at hotmail.com. I think it's a hotmail. No, it's not. What? It's not 1987. It's Royal History Geeks at gmail.com. I think it is. It's royalhistorygeeks at gmail.com. But if in doubt, royalhistorygeeks.co.uk. No, royalhistorygeeks.com will have the email address on. I'll put a slide at the end of this saying how people can get in contact, because they may feel we don't have an entirely thorough grasp of this.
Well, the thing is everybody has so much social media nowadays, and so many different. Gareth, as you know, I have about 3,000 emails that sometimes my brain just goes, no, I can't think about that.
No, exactly.
James, as well, is there anywhere else you can add that people can contact you both?
Really, not yet. I'm in the process of setting something up, so
watch this space then.
Yeah. So in the meantime, if you just want to give your personal number, James, people can just give you a call, can't they?
Yeah. 07. That's not.
And your address, and we can all pop round.
Yeah, just pop round. It's probably easiest. Yeah, do it the old-fashioned way.
Yeah. I mean, let me know first, then I could have made a cake for when you get round.
But I should say as well, Royal History Geeks is a community, and in this instance, it's James and I that are leading this. But that's why the podcast will change, because with Coronation Catastrophes, the 4 main episodes we recorded all because of timings. We recorded all at once and then dropped them, so they didn't change as a result of feedback. But we will be getting comment, and inevitably, again, because we're not necessarily claiming to be experts in 1930s Britain, we will get comments from people saying, "Oh, have you read this article? Because it would really help you just." With that point you're trying to make, you need to read this, it'll make sense to you. And we will include that as we go with the episodes. We haven't put a full timeline together yet, but basically we want to be doing one a week, probably with a week off for Christmas. These will probably all be out by the end of January. But people will engage, and what they say will influence how we shape the content, I suspect. And the last episode, I think, will all be questions.
Yeah.
You are
I was going to say, and when we've done a couple more podcasts more recently, we've been able to include a lot of the questions that people have asked, and that's been really good, and sort of it helps challenge your own thought process, but also it's good to see that people are engaging with it, and they're giving you their opinions as well.
So I was going to say, you are on Discord as well, aren't you?
Yeah, we've got a young and growing Discord group, and it's still in the quite early stages. But Royal History Geeks on Discord, we will certainly
discussions.
We'll certainly get chats going on there.
And if you don't know much about Discord, don't panic. If I can use it, so can you. But you can certainly put in lots of different threads of discussions, and that will be, I would imagine, a really fun place to talk about this and any of the other areas that James and Gareth cover as well. So fantastic. So you've got an awful lot going on, really, and I think this sounds like a really exciting project, because people do series of things on all sorts of different mediums, and they have a plan. like you have a plan, but it is often a little bit less fluid. It's very much, we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about this. So in fact, I think that you're prepared to see us as like a living organism that's developing as it goes. And people are able to have that input is really valuable. It's nice for people to be able to engage in history. I think that's what we need in history, is to allow people more engagement in active projects. And it really brings it to life a lot more. And I think all of us are going to really enjoy what you have to share with us, but enjoy seeing, for me, I think really enjoying to see how this grows. I don't want to use the word experiment because that makes it sound a little bit New Age and hippie. But and we're not very good with New Age in history because that's not our bag. But certainly a new way of presenting things and seeing how this moves forward. So I hope you're both feeling super excited about this. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us all so that people get to know you a little bit better, and maybe what you are most excited about, what you're hoping to get out of this, and as people who work in and study history, where you think it's going to take you in your own personal journeys?
That's an interesting question. What do you reckon, James?
Is that a bit deep and mean?
No, I like it.
Well, I'm sure it will help me because I do quite a lot of talks about the current royal family and photography. And one of the questions that I was always asked was, would the Queen ever abdicate in favour of Charles?
Yes,
and now I tend to get people asking, do you think Charles will abdicate in favour of William? And I think that, and I've always given, replies of, that's never very likely. And even, although I suppose the only time I sort of wavered when Prince Philip announced his retirement from royal duties, that I did then wonder, might something happen with the Queen? But I think that there is still an interest there, and I think that looking at the abdication crisis in more detail helps you, one, answer that question, but also spark more of a debate when people ask you questions like that, because you're able then to root it in the context of a history and of abdication, what that has meant, and then contrast that with what happens in the European monarchies. And so I think that having looked at it in more depth will provide useful evidence for that.
I think for me, what I'm excited about is this whole project goes back to the roots of what Royal History Geeks was meant to be, and what my original vision for it was when I, sat there in my living room, in my pajamas, set up a Facebook page one day. And the reason, and let me explain a bit more what I mean by that. I've always tried to avoid ever referring to myself as a historian, or as an expert, because I've always thought my role was to be geek in chief, as I call it, in that we're all just in fitting it into our busy lives, however we can, just some exploration and discovery of the past, where it's not experts, it's all us in together, just geeking out, trying to find out what we can, carving out that little bit of escape and reflection in a way that actually does help us live our lives and manage our own futures better. Now, for me, because I've been so fortunate in the success I've had with Royal History Geeks, it has led me on to more academic research. It has led me on to publishing. There are certain areas now where that's not the right way for me to present, and that's not the right way for me to come to the table. If you write a book about the Tudors, people rightly expect you to bring a degree of knowledge and a degree of expertise, and to be in a position where you're imparting that. And of course, it's still conversational and discursive and dialogue, but you are the leader in that conversation. This, for me, is not an area where I have expertise, but I do have a lot of geeky enthusiasm. And again, so it's right back to that Royal History Geeks mission of, together, we're going to geek out about this, and we'll all learn together. No one's the expert. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, I think the period that Gareth and I sit most comfortably in is probably the most studied. And I do think people's knowledge, what the people are missing if they're interested in monarchy and the history of the monarchy, whether they're pro or anti-monarchy or that's changed, is what's going on in when I say modern, maybe not, maybe the last 1 to 200 years. I know that's not modern, but certainly the
it's
structure. Yeah, well, exactly, it is. And, certainly that is very different from when people think about the study of the monarchy. It might be very different to how people would perceive it. I always describe Tudors as the gateway drug into history. If you can get that, you've got them, because it's what people do at school. It's the most written about period. It's the most televised period. It's the most blogged about period. And I think maybe more modern monarchy is something that is really valuable to discuss, because again, it's about context and putting everything together. Why have we ended up where we are? I think there are so many other things to distract us these days, that monarchy isn't what it was, because we don't have the divine right to rule. We don't have the monarchy ruling. We have them reigning, and it's a big gap. It's really, really missing from people's knowledge and what's taught in schools and other institutions. So to be able to put a little bit more of this more modern information and context about the royal family we have now and in the last 100 years and since the big event, the Abdication Crisis, it's really valuable to give people a rounded knowledge of what's gone on in royal history. And James, you've mentioned as well, what was going on, the abdications in other European countries. I think it's really, really easy for us when we work in British history, and for people who study at all sorts of different levels, to be quite, we sort of isolate ourselves out in the country. We don't look at what's happening abroad and in the wider context and the interrelationships we had with other, especially European countries. We really sort of crowd ourselves into this little space, and we focus a lot on what was going on our doorstep. And because of I may be making a digression here, but because of the 3,000 million children that Victoria and Albert had, and then all the royal houses.
9, but yes.
In the middle somewhere, and the fact that they married in, obviously, to the royal houses across Europe, and then the knock-on effects that has had from that. And then, of course, we're starting to see those knock-on effects in the lifetimes of people we know or have known. And that makes a really massive difference to how we can relate to things. So I think putting this all together with something like this that is newer, it's more modern, it will touch base with people, because there will be people around who are going to remember it. And I think that's going to have a really different and valuable edge to talking about. As much as Gareth and I will late medieval ourselves to the end of time, I think it's going to give a really interesting perspective that people may not have had or be able to get elsewhere. So I think this sounds absolutely fantastic. I am really excited for it, as obviously are both of you, from the discussion that we've had today and before we came on and initially said about doing this. So obviously Gareth has talked a little bit about where you can find him and how you can contact him, and James, to ask any of your questions, put your questions forward, or any general observations that you would like to make. Obviously, wherever you do leave your comments, please be kind and constructive. We don't want any nonsense. We're not here for the nonsense. Gentlemen, once again, thank you so much for sharing all your information and your knowledge and your excitement and enthusiasm for what we have to come. I think everyone's going to really, really enjoy this series that you're putting together. And this is only season 1. So there was more excitement to come. So keep watching this space. Enjoy this season to see where we're going to go. Please do get in touch with the gentleman if there is anything else that you would like to share. And thank you very much for spending your time with us today. We really, really appreciate it. And so goodbye for now.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Royal Revolutions is a Royal History Geeks podcast. For more information about our other podcasts, head to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts. The Royal History Geeks community is active across Facebook, X, YouTube, Instagram, and Discord. Just search for Royal History Geeks on your social platform of choice, and you should find us there. The first episode of Royal Revolutions dropped in December 2024. The entire first season will focus on the Abdication Crisis. Toward the end of Season 1, we will devote an entire episode to questions, so please get in touch with us via our socials or at royalhistorygeeks@gmail.com to send any questions about the Abdication Crisis our way.